They came in silence, down the narrow paths of Balkan villages, through the mountain roads of Greece, and across the valleys of Albania and Serbia. At their head rode Ottoman officials, flanked by soldiers carrying scrolls, lists of names, ages, and villages. They had come to collect a tax, but not in coins or crops. This tax was paid in children. The villagers called it devshirme, the blood tribute. Every few years, the Ottoman Empire demanded boys between 8 and 15. No family was spared. No plea was heard. The strongest, the brightest, the most handsome, these were taken first. Their parents wept as the agents marked them, whispering prayers to gods who seemed far away. When the children disappeared over the horizon, their names were erased. They would never return. But these boys, stolen from their homes, were not destined for death. They were bound for transformation. The empire would strip them of their past, reshape their minds, and rebuild their bodies. They would become something new: the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite soldiers. Warriors feared across continents, slaves who became masters of war. For the Ottoman Empire, the devshirme system wasn't an act of cruelty. It was statecraft. The empire stretched from North Africa to the Balkans, filled with rival tribes, faiths, and languages. Loyalty was fragile, so the sultans needed an army that owed allegiance to no one but them. An army without family ties, tribal loyalties, or ambitions beyond the empire's will. The solution was as brilliant as it was brutal. Take children of the conquered, raise them as Muslims, and train them to serve the throne. Each boy was marched hundreds of miles to Anatolia. They traveled in long lines, barefoot, hungry, silent. Those who survived the journey were brought to Turkish villages, where they lived among peasants and learned the language. They were taught to pray in Arabic, to obey without hesitation, and to forget the world they came from. Their Christian names were replaced with Turkish ones. Their childhood memories faded like dreams at dawn. Then, after years of conditioning, the strongest were chosen for a new life inside the walls of the Sultaness barracks, a fortress of discipline, silence, and obedience. Here began the making of a Janissary. They trained from dawn until nightfall. They learned archery, swordsmanship, and the art of formation warfare. Every movement, every breath was drilled until it became instinct. They were forbidden to marry, to trade, or to own property. Desire and distraction were sins. They belonged to the Sultan body, mind, and soul. The barracks were their world. Within its walls, laughter was rare, rest was brief, and failure meant punishment. But slowly, pain gave way to pride. Among themselves, they found a new family: brothers bound not by blood, but by suffering and survival. They ate together, slept in rows, trained side by side, and swore to protect each other to death. They became the Sultan's chosen sons, and their loyalty was absolute. To the outside world, they were a mystery. Their silver helmets gleamed in perfect rows, their steps thundered in unison. When they marched through Istanbul, people whispered and made way. They were slaves, yes, but slaves feared even by kings. The Janissaries were unlike any other soldiers in the world. They weren't hired mercenaries or hereditary nobles. They were professional warriors, trained for life. They obeyed commands without question. And when the Sultan called for war, they didn't just fight, they devoured the battlefield. At the siege of Constantinople in 1453, their name became legend. For weeks, Ottoman cannon pounded the city's walls. When the time came to storm the breach, it was the Janissaries who led the charge. Through clouds of smoke and fire, they advanced silent, disciplined, unstoppable. The Byzantine defenders saw a human wall of steel. When the gates finally broke, the Empire of Rome fell. The world changed, and at the center of that moment stood the Janissaries. They became the symbol of Ottoman might, the empire's spine, its weapon, its pride. They became the symbol of Ottoman might, the empire's spine, its weapon, its pride. Kings feared them. Europe called them monsters. But within the empire they were admired, envied, and respected. They weren't nobles, yet their rank could raise a peasant's son to the status of a governor or general. Even the Grand Vizier, the Sultan's right hand, could rise from the Janissary corps. They were proof that loyalty and strength mattered more than birth. And for a time, the system worked perfectly. But power has a way of reshaping the loyal. As victories multiplied, the Janissaries began to realize their importance. Without them, no campaign could succeed. Without their protection, no sultan was safe. Their pride grew, and with it, ambition. They began to influence politics, demand privileges, and question the orders they once obeyed without hesitation. Sultans rewarded them with gold and favors, hoping to maintain their loyalty. But the more they gained, the less they feared. The army that once served as the empire's instrument was slowly becoming its master. And before we continue deeper into the empire's darkest chapter, take a moment to join our journey. If stories like this fascinate you, the hidden sides of history, the forgotten truths buried in empire and blood, then subscribe to Tortured Past. Because what comes next is the part history tried to erase. The shift began quietly, in whispers and bribes. Janissary officers grew rich from trade and corruption, despite strict bans. Many married secretly, passed their privileges to sons, and turned their sacred brotherhood into an inheritance. The devshirme system, once the core of their purity, began to decay. Soon, Muslim families bribed officials to get their sons accepted into the corps, chasing the wealth and power it offered. The Janissaries were no longer foreign slaves. They were now Ottoman-born, entitled, and politically dangerous. They still wore the same uniforms, still marched in perfect lines, but their hearts had changed. They were no longer the Sultan's weapon. They were his threat. When the empire tried to modernize its army, they resisted violently. They refused new weapons, mocked European tactics, and dismissed reformers as traitors. The empire that had once advanced through innovation was now chained by the very men who had built it. By the 17th century, Istanbul trembled under their power. When taxes rose, they rioted. When wages fell, they overthrew viziers. When they disliked a sultan, they replaced him. The Janissaries became kingmakers, executioners, and rebels all at once. One account describes the streets of Istanbul burning in 1622. The Sultan Osman II had tried to reform the army and reduce the Janissaries' influence. He planned to build a new force loyal only to him, a mirror of what the Janissaries once were. They discovered his plans. Their response was swift and merciless. They stormed the palace, tore down his banners, and dragged the young sultan from his chambers. He begged for his life, but his own soldiers strangled him with a bowstring. The Janissaries, who had once killed for the sultan, now killed the sultan himself. The empire never fully recovered from that betrayal. By the 18th century, the corps had become an obstacle to progress. They resisted firearms, sabotaged reforms, and drained the treasury. Their once legendary training collapsed into ceremonial drills and parades. They were still feared, but more for their rage than their discipline. The Ottoman Empire, facing a modern Europe of cannons and organized armies, began to crumble under its own weight. And yet the Janissaries clung to their privileges like kings on borrowed thrones. But power built on fear cannot last forever. In 1826, the new Sultan Mahmud II decided the empire could no longer endure their defiance. He had tried reform and persuasion. Both failed. So he turned to the only language the Janissaries once understood: force. Rumors spread through Istanbul that the Sultan planned to replace the Janissaries with a new modern army. The soldiers gathered in revolt, confident they could once again bend the throne to their will. They filled the streets, chanting, beating their drums, demanding Mahmud's submission. But this time the Sultan was ready. He ordered his loyal troops to seal the barracks. Artillery was positioned at every gate. And then, without warning, cannon fire erupted through the heart of the city. Flames engulfed the barracks. The thunder of guns drowned out the drums. The Janissaries fought, but the empire they had once built now turned its weapons against them. By nightfall, thousands lay dead. The core, once the pride of the empire, was annihilated. The survivors were executed, exiled, or stripped of rank. The Sultan called it the auspicious incident. For the Ottomans, it was both an ending and a rebirth. After nearly 4 centuries, the Janissaries were gone. But their legacy refused to die. Their discipline had shaped the empire's greatest victories. Their corruption had nearly destroyed it. They were the symbol of Ottoman glory and its greatest flaw. Even today, their story stands as one of history's cruelest paradoxes. Children stolen from their homes became the protectors of the very empire that enslaved them. Slaves who learned to command kings, warriors who conquered the world and were later crushed by their own creation. Their tale is a mirror held up to empire itself. How loyalty becomes power, how power becomes pride, and how pride devours everything it touches. The Janissaries were not villains, nor were they saints. They were men shaped by history's coldest hands, molded through pain, faith, and obedience. They were born of fear and forged into devotion. And in the end, their fall was not just the end of an army, but the death of an idea that control can last forever. Empires rise on the backs of those who serve them, but they fall when those same hands learn their strength. That is the legacy of the Janissaries, the empire's sharpest blade and its deepest wound. If you've stayed with us this far, you've walked through one of the darkest corridors of Ottoman history. The story of the Janissaries is more than a tale of war. It is a lesson about ambition, obedience, and rebellion. And if you believe history should be told raw, real, and unfiltered, subscribe to Tortured Past, because here history never sleeps.